The forest was a quilt of shadows and fading light by the time we set out that afternoon. Thick blankets of pine and fir towered above, their needles rustling quietly in a breeze that caught the scent of damp earth and old moss. The sky's pale blue was already dimming into the subtle golds and lavenders of dusk, the kind that makes everything seem softer, yet stranger, less defined. My boots sank slightly into the cushion of fallen leaves as I led the way, glancing back every few steps at Reed. He was slower, careful, his sandy blonde hair tousled by the breeze, his face a little tight with concentration, like every movement through the underbrush was a calculated risk. We'd been partners for just a few weeks, but this was our first real mission together. A call had come in about a hiker who'd gone missing some miles from the refuge cabin where we were stationed. A patch of rough, dense wilderness whose mood could shift from welcoming to merciless in a heartbeat. Me, Caleb, 32, used to the quiet authority the role of wilderness medic demanded, experienced, reliable, a little too comfortable in the wild solitude. Reed, younger, 29, still carrying the ghost of his breakup. Like a shadow across his lean frame, his clear blue eyes scanned the undergrowth, wary and alert, but there was a tension to him, one that made my gut twist. It was hard to tell if it was the wilderness itself or something deeper. "Keep to the trails and keep your eyes sharp," I reminded him, voice low over the rustle of the woods. The daylight was thinning, the chill was starting to nip at our exposed skin. I'd seen too many lost souls out here to take any chances. Reed gave me a nod that was almost a shrug, lips pressed tight. "I'm good," he said, voice a shade too quick, like he was brushing off a doubt rather than telling the truth. I caught the flicker of hesitation there and filed it away. Watching him carefully, we pushed onward deeper into the maze of trees and uneven ground. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and shift as I moved. I heard a sudden scuffle of feet behind me and turned sharply. Reed wasn't where I expected. He was off the path, stepping gingerly through a patch of thick ferns, looking momentarily lost. "Reed!" "Hey, stay on the path," I called, trying to keep my voice calm, but there was a sharp edge beneath. "Don't wander off." There was no immediate reply. When finally he looked up, his face was pale under the fading light, eyes wide, scanning the trees as if the woods themselves had betrayed him. Cold air cracked around us, making my breath fog in the shrinking space between us. I thought I saw something," Reed whispered, his voice shaky. "I just wanted to. Maybe I got turned around." The words stumbled out, fragmented. I shook my head, stepping toward him, closing the gap, but careful not to crowd him. "It's easy to get turned around here. The forest can swallow you whole if you're not careful." I reached out, lightly gripping his arm to steady him. Beneath my fingers, his skin was damp with sweat despite the dropping temperature. He swallowed hard. "I don't know how to use the compass you showed me," he admitted, voice almost inaudible now. Something inside me softened. All at once, the rugged facade I'd built thinly around my own vulnerabilities felt thinner. Two, teased apart by the rawness in his eyes, he wasn't just a partner to get the job done. He was a man, adrift, scared, human. "Come on," I said, guiding him back toward the trail with gentle insistence. "We stick together. No one wanders off alone, especially not when the cold's setting in." I could feel his trembling under the fabric of his jacket, the quiet desperation in his posture. Our breath mingled in the cold air, now fog, rising like a ghost between us as night crept closer. I saw the way he flinched at every sudden noise, the way his hands shook beside me, and, despite everything, a fierce protectiveness bloomed inside me. This wasn't just survival. It was something more fragile, something that had nothing to do with protocol or procedure. When I finally found him curled against the base of a towering spruce, Cold and numb to the point of whispering hypothermia, my heart clenched in sharp, unfamiliar ways. I knelt beside him, my fingers quick and sure as I stripped away his soaked sleeve to check the rough scrapes on his hands. The skin was raw and partially torn, smudged dark with dirt and pine needles. His blue eyes caught mine, wide and unguarded, the vulnerability radiating between us like a line drawn in frost. "I'm sorry," he muttered, voice breaking just enough that I thought I might lose it myself. "I didn't mean to slow you down. I just got scared." "You did fine," I said, meaning it, letting the usual stiffness in my voice crumble. "We all get scared. Doesn't make you any less capable. Or anything else." The last words were left hanging, unsaid, but heavy in the air. He looked away, jaw clenched tight, and for a moment the forest around us seemed to hold its breath. Then his hand brushed lightly against mine, a hesitant, uncertain contact, and my breath hitched. The night grew colder, but the thin crack of warmth between us refused to break. We sat there in silence, broken no longer by fear, but something quieter, something beginning. By the time we made it back to the cabin, the sky had blossomed fully into night, stars scattered like distant knowing eyes across the ink-black canvas. The rescue cabin was a small wooden structure, worn by weather and time, but inside it carried a warmth that seemed almost sacred. Crackling from the hearth filled the space with the scent of burning wood, mingling with the faint metallic sharpness of first aid supplies neatly arranged on a nearby table. I guided Reed inside, helping him remove his soaked layers with gentle insistence as he trembled from the cold and exhaustion. "All right," I said, trying to keep my tone light, even playful. Mr. stared. "Lost in the woods. Let's see what you've got." I pulled on a pair of disposable gloves and began cleaning the scrapes on his hands with antiseptic, the sting briefly making him flinch. "You're lucky. Looks worse than it really is." "Bye. Could have been a lot messier if you'd gone down hard." "Yeah, I'm a bloody mess," Reed muttered, settling into a worn armchair by the fire. His fingers twitched as I worked, and, though he insisted he was fine, the slight shake in his voice made me chuckle softly. "Come on, admit it," I teased, wiping the last smear of dirt from a particularly nasty scratch on his knuckle. "You're practically my patient now." "I'm doctor's orders, whether you like it or not." Reed's lips curled into a brief, reluctant smile. "Guess that makes you my savior." "No," I said with mock seriousness, wrapping a bandage around his palm. "I prefer guardian of the wilderness and reluctant helmsman to the wandering." I winked, and for the first time that day he laughed. A soft, genuine sound that brushed against the quiet like a breeze teasing the leaves outside. He looked up at me, blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "I didn't mean to be such a screw-up," he said quietly, voice barely above a whisper. "Hey, you'll screw up," I said, settling on the edge of the chair opposite him. "What matters is how you get back up. Besides, it's not like I haven't lost my way before." Something unspoken passed between us then. An acknowledgement beyond words, a mutual recognition of broken parts that sometimes just needed time to heal. The room grew colder as the firelight flickered low, but the air between us seemed warmer now, charged with the kind of unspoken possibility that creeps up slowly. My hand brushed against his while reaching for a fresh pair of gloves. The contact was accidental but electric. Reed's breath hitched, and he didn't pull away. We caught each other's eyes then, and for a heartbeat, something fragile and tentative bloomed in the space between us. A break in the armor that neither of us had dared to lower before. The silence stretched, comfortable and full of questions. Neither of us was ready to answer. "You sure you're okay?" I asked, voice softer now, genuinely concerned. "Yeah," he answered almost too quickly. But then he shook his head and let out a long breath, the tension breaking. "Thanks for not making me feel like a total idiot out there." I smiled, the dimple in my cheek deepening. "Hey, wilderness survival is a team sport. Next time, stick closer. And maybe stop trying to impress me with your disaster skills." He snorted softly, eyes crinkling at the corners. "Deal." Laughter settled between us, the kind that patches cracks and warms cold rooms. Outside, the night pressed against the window panes, dark and deep. But inside the cabin, something gentler took root, fragile and slow, a new kind of trust dawning where only lost steps had been before. It was the first night of many, and though neither of us spoke the word aloud, it was clear. The woods had changed us both, and maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something neither of us saw coming. The cold never really left entirely, but the fire between us, that grew quietly, steadily, would burn on past the dawn. Morning light filtered through the frostskin panes of the cabin window, casting long pale beams that stretched across the worn wooden floorboards. The first blush of dawn felt like a fragile promise, soft and new, contrasting sharply with the rawness clinging to us both from the night before. The world outside was still wrapped in a slumbering quiet, but inside, the weight of unspoken things pressed against the air, thick and expectant. Reed stirred on the threadbare sofa, his tousled blonde hair a mess of bedhead halos that caught the dawn's light in a halo of soft gold. He sat up slowly, rubbing a hand over his face, eyes squinting against the intrusion of brightness. I watched, half out of instinct, half born of a new kind of tender curiosity that edged every glance in his direction. The vulnerability he'd shown the night before, the fractures beneath his strong, lean frame, had unsettled me more than I wanted to admit, and yet it was a relief, too. The sharp, jagged edges of guarded silence cracking just enough so something human might seep through. "Morning," I said quietly, folding my arms over my chest to keep warm despite the fire's stubborn embers. He blinked a few times, then gave me a half-smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his clear blue eyes. "Morning," he answered, voice rough with sleep and something heavier underneath. He waited a heartbeat, then asked quietly, "Can I say something weird?" "Go for it." He swallowed and looked away, towards the near-empty kettle on the counter. The silence stretched out between us like frozen glass. Then he spoke slow and hesitant, as though the words were caught somewhere between his throat and his heart. "It's not just about getting lost out there, I think. I've been kind of lost for a while." He let out a humorless laugh and shook his head, not geographically, emotionally, mentally, maybe all of it. He brushed a hand through his hair, frustration flickering in his eyes. "I don't talk about it much. Not really." The way he said it, tentative, vulnerable, tugged at me. I pulled my chair closer, resting my elbows on the rough pine table between us. "If you want to, you can talk to me." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "It's just, after my last relationship ended, everything felt like it stopped making sense. Not because she was bad or anything, no dramatic scenes or shocking betrayals, just quiet, unraveling." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the effort it took to keep it together. We slipped apart while pretending we didn't. Months of pretending, and then one day she told me she wasn't happy anymore. Not with me. Not really. She'd fallen out of love, like the light had gone out in the room, and she couldn't find it again. He paused, eyes fixed on the faded grain of the table, tracing invisible scars etched in wood. I could see the rawness beneath his usual guarded exterior, the ache of someone not just hurt, but profoundly disoriented. I thought I could fix it. I thought if I just... He stopped, swallowed hard. If I just tried harder, if I was different, Maybe she'd want to stay, but she didn't, and I never knew how to say goodbye to that. His story hung heavy between us, and I swallowed, feeling the familiar ache stirring deep in my chest, the old wounds resettling beneath a new weight. "Sounds like you carried that alone for a while," I said softly. "I get it. I really do." He looked up, surprise flickering briefly in his eyes. "You do?" I nodded. "Yeah. When I lost Ben, it was sudden, a car accident on a rainy night. She was gone before I could even say goodbye." My voice dropped, thick with memory. People think if you loved someone enough, they just stick with you. But sometimes, love's not enough to stop the world spinning off its axis. I clenched my fists restlessly, the memory still sharp and jagged. That kind of loss changes you. Leaves cracks you don't see until you're staring down at the pieces. Reed's pale face softened, and he reached out, tentatively, one hand resting near mine on the table, not touching, but close enough to bridge the chasm between us. "That's why I didn't expect. Not all this. I mean, you're not just the guy who found me wandering in the dark. You're someone who's been broken and collected yourself. Maybe better than I have." His voice was quieter now, vulnerable in the way words rarely allowed. "I thought I was just a mess, but maybe you're a mess too. Maybe we both are." "That's the thing," I said, the warmth creeping slowly into my chest. Unsteady, but real. "Broken doesn't mean useless." I met his gaze squarely. "It means we're human." A tense sigh slipped out between them. "Human," he echoed, the word tasting foreign and oddly comforting. For a while, we sat in silence, two fractured people finding a shared space to settle the shards of our past. It wasn't tidy or clean, but it was honest. And in that raw honesty, an unexpected weight eased, just enough to make breathing a little less hard. The woods around us still loomed, filled with cold, with threats, but inside, something warmer had begun to root itself. Not love, not yet, but the fragile tendrils of understanding, of shared brokenness. I felt something almost like hope, asterisk, asterisk. Later that morning, the routine of the day nudged us back into reality. The cold wind brushing against the cabin's worn siding, the smell of pine needles sharpened by frost, the scrape of boots over the gravel, as we prepared to get out again. But beneath the practical motions, an unspoken tension simmered fragile, like thin ice, waiting to crack under a careless step. We moved through our tasks with tentative ease, packing gear into worn packs and checking the radios, the habitual rhythm of survival, trying to fill the spaces where conversation feared to tread. The crisp air bit at our faces as we darted between shadow and sunlight, the quiet interrupted only by the occasional clink of metal, the soft snap of zippers, the distant call of a lone jay echoing through the trees. I noticed how Reed's movements were different today, not the easy confidence of a man who owned the wilderness, but the hesitancy of someone still finding footholds after the darkness. There was a tension in the set of his jaw, the quick darting of his eyes, as if some part of him remained back home, tangled in memories and regrets. I kept my distance, unsure how to bridge the gap without stepping over boundaries still too raw to cross, until something unexpected broke the silence. I was crouched by the riverbank, sorting through a box of survival rations, when Reed suddenly burst out with a dry, deadpan comment that caught me off guard. "Guess if our last rescue involves less getting lost in the woods and more actually following the damn trail, I might start to think you're not such a terrible partner after all." The corner of my mouth twitched in surprise. "Is that your attempt at a joke?" He shrugged, but there was a sly glint in his blue eyes. "Could be. I'm trying to survive here. You try not to make me look like a complete rookie." I laughed, the sound catching me off guard. The way it lifted something tight inside me, loosening the knots of tension I didn't realize I was carrying. "Well, say you're doing a great job so far. Consider me impressed. That's the best you've got? He teased, cocking an eyebrow. I grinned and stood up, the muscles in my legs aching pleasantly from the movement. You want better? You'll have to earn it. Challenge accepted, Reed said, mock seriousness coloring his tone. Then, after a beat, he gestured to my pack. You sure that survival manual you've been carrying isn't just a collection of dad jokes disguised as advice? Ha, I said, shaking my head, warmth blooming behind my ribs. Watch out. One day I'll have you quoting it back to me around the campfire. He chuckled, a low, easy sound that seemed to strip away some of the leftover shadows clinging to his features. I'm counting on it. We fell into a rhythm then, not just the mechanical work of packing and checking, but a quiet companionship stitched with jokes and small smiles. Humor, it seemed, was a bridge we hadn't known we needed, something that made the cold less biting, the silence less sharp. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. There was an ache in my chest as I glanced sidelong at him, watching the way his laugh crinkled the corners of his eyes, the way he caught my gaze with a crooked smile that held something unspoken. The knowledge that both of us were tiptoeing around something neither dared to name, but both were quietly reaching for. For the first time since the night we found him shivering and half lost, Reed felt like more than a puzzle to solve or a crisis to manage. He felt like someone I wanted to be around, not just out of duty, but because something in the way he moved, the way he was fighting and laughing and breaking, made me want to believe that maybe, just maybe, the story in these woods wasn't finished yet. As the sun climbed higher, thawing the frost and lighting up the forest with fresh gold, I knew this was just the beginning. Of friendship, of trust, of something more complicated and beautiful. We were both still broken in our own ways, but maybe that was what made the possibility of healing feel real. The woods might have trapped us together, but it was the fragile warmth between us, sometimes quiet, sometimes sharp, that made me think we could find a way forward after all. And maybe, when the night came again and the cold pressed in, that warmth would be enough to keep us both from getting lost. The forest around them was dense, the branches tangled like the nerves in Reed's stomach as they moved through the simulation course. It wasn't a real rescue, just a drill designed to test their readiness, but the tension hung thick enough to choke on the air, was damp, heavy with the scent of moss and pine needle decay. Frost clung stubbornly to the shaded ground, crunching underfoot with each measured step. There was an ever-present pressure to perform, prove they were both acutely aware of the stakes, even if the consequences were only hypothetical. Reed's chest tightened as he approached the simulated victim's location. His heart thrummed too loudly in his ears, the sound jarring against the otherwise muted forest. He could feel eyes on him, not just Caleb's, though those were the ones that burned the brightest, but the teams watching, waiting. Everyone relying on him. The weight of it threatened to bend his resolve. He paused 100 feet from the target spot, agitation knotting the muscles in his shoulders. It wasn't physical exhaustion that stopped him. No, it was something deeper, a sudden invisible wall cracking inside his confidence. The same wall that had never quite healed since years ago, since the accident that fractured not just his body, but his trust in the world. Caleb was beside him in an instant, the easy certainty in his movements grounding. "Hey," Caleb said, voice low and steady. "We're okay." Reed blinked, forcing himself to breathe. "I don't know." His voice was rough, barely audible. "I'm freezing up." Caleb's eyes didn't judge. They held patience and something more. A quiet understanding that didn't ask him to explain every tremor in his mind and heart. "Let's take it one step at a time. Just breathe with me." The cold air filled their lungs together, slow and deliberate. In through the nose, out through parted lips. The forest seemed to pause around them. The wind hushed, the trees holding their breath, as if they could sense something breaking and fixing itself all at once. Reed's fingers curled into fists. It's stupid to lock up like this during a drill. His voice sharpened with frustration. but Caleb didn't flinch. "It's not stupid," Caleb said quietly. "You've been through hell. And you're still standing here. That's not nothing." Reed swallowed the lump that threatened his throat. The words weren't a solution, but they were a lifeline. A tether he could clutch in the storm of doubt. Caleb's presence was a balm, steady and warm, running beneath the cold, anxious shiver of his skin. "We need to find that victim," Caleb reminded him gently. "Remember what we practiced? Slow, methodical. You lead. I'm right behind you." Reed nodded, the tension loosening just enough to let his body obey. The breath in, breath out became less forced, the pounding in his chest less frantic. Caleb's faith in him, as quiet as the forest night and as unshakable, was a salve he hadn't realized he'd been desperate for. Step by step, Reed moved forward, tremor in his limbs fading as he found rhythm again. The forest swallowed the noise of doubt, leaving only the focused sound of their approach. Caleb's steady footsteps mirrored his own, the unspoken agreement between them growing thicker, stronger, not just teammates, but something more. When Reed knelt beside the prone figure, wrapped in an orange survival blanket, Caleb crouched beside him, careful hands checking vitals and responsiveness. The tension inside Reed became something almost bearable. The drill still pressed on. The clock was ticking. But there was room now for something else, a quiet trust blooming between them, beneath the sprayed canopy of branches and slivered sunlight. "Got it," Caleb said, softly, voice angled with encouragement. "You did this. You're capable. Don't let one moment win." Reed's jaw relaxed, and although it was only a simulation, relief swept through him like a much-needed rush of warmth. They had gotten through it together. It was more than just a medical check or procedure. It was a step on a path neither of them yet fully understood, but both were willing to walk. Asterisk, 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 night came on swift and sharp, the sky deepening to a velvet indigo spattered with stars. The campfire crackled between them, glowing embers throwing soft light against their faces. The air was still cold, but less ruthless now than earlier, softened by the slow burn of fire and the closeness of company. They sat apart at first, Reed curled into himself on a log, Caleb perched on a nearby rock. But the distance felt wrong in a way neither could ignore. Reed's gaze wandered over the flickering flames, thoughts spiraling in the quiet. The mask he'd carried for so long, the armor that had kept him safe in the fragmented shards of his past, was slipping, cracking, under the strain of the day's honesty and exhaustion. His breath hitched, the thin space between them too vast still. And then, hesitant and raw, Reed let the dam break. His voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with the weight of years he hadn't spoken aloud. "I'm scared," he admitted. "I've been scared for so long. Not just during drills or rescues, but of getting close to someone, of letting someone see inside. Because eventually you get hurt." The firelight flickered over Caleb's face as he absorbed the confession, the blue of his eyes steady and warm in the night. For a moment there was silence, heavy with understanding, the kind that carries no judgment, but an unspoken promise to hold space for another's truth. "I get that," Caleb said quietly. "More than you know." Reed shifted, surprised by the softness in Caleb's tone. "You do?" Caleb nodded, stepping a fraction closer, shrinking the distance that had felt like a chasm. "I've always had this fear too, of losing control, of not being enough, of being broken and never being fixed. I guess I never really thought anyone could make me feel safe. Not like I do now." Reed blinked, the admission catching him off guard. Caleb strong and steady, fragile in ways Reed hadn't dared to imagine. For the first time since the night they found Reed shivering and lost among the trees, there was no need to hide behind sarcasm or professionalism. No rehearsed smiles or guarded words. They sat side by side, not as rescuer and patient, or as teammates simply completing a mission, but as two men exposed to the same raw, quiet space of need. Reed let his shoulder lean against Caleb's, tentative and searching for grounding. Caleb didn't pull away. He shifted, offering the unexpected comfort of physical presence, a subtle warmth spreading through the chill night air. "I never thought I could just be with someone like this," Reed confessed. Voice vulnerable. "Not like this, without pretending or running or hating myself for needing something I didn't know how to ask for." "You don't have to run anymore," Caleb said, voice low and steady, the dimple in his cheek catching the firelight. "Not here." "Not with me," Reed's throat tightened, the words wrapping around him like a shield more protective than any gear they carried in the field. It was strange to feel safe, almost foreign, but the sensation was sinking in, steady and real. Maybe it was the woods, or the night, or what they'd been through together, but for once, Reed didn't want to hide from the ache of needing someone who wouldn't let go. Caleb's hand hovered for a moment before settling gently on Reed's fingers, curling around his with deliberate care. It was a quiet gesture, no promises, no demands, just the simple truth that they were both here. Together, in that small, flickering moment. Reed exhaled, leaning into the touch, letting the cold and fear recede just a little more. "Thank you," he whispered, "for staying." Caleb's smile was soft, the warmth radiating beyond the fire's glow. Always, the night wrapped around them then, a silent witness to something fragile, something new, a bond forged not through bravery or success, but through the simple act of showing up, broken and open, in the quiet dark. For the first time, Reed didn't feel lost, not in the woods, not in himself, and not beside Caleb. And that alone was enough to make the cold less sharp, the silence less heavy. Somewhere between the ache and the laughter, through fear and the flicker of a shared flame, they found something real to hold on to. Until dawn. The wind had shifted sometime after dawn, but instead of clearing, it picked up grit, and grit turned to thick flakes, drifting down in relentless swirls. The sky went heavy and low in an instant, and the woods, so silent and still only hours before, converted into a muffled whiteout. The fire's glow flickered uncertainly against the growing storm, pressing hard against the cabin's thin walls. Outside, the world was disappearing under a blanket that seemed eager to bury past footprints and doubts alike. Caleb shifted, brushing a stray lock of damp hair from his forehead. His eyes traced the window pane where the snow tangled like ghostly fingers, erasing paths and familiar shapes. "Looks like we're stuck here a while longer," he said quietly. Reed nodded. Tension still curled tight in his chest, a low hum of restlessness thrumming beneath his skin. The storm was a cruel twister trap, holding them captive after survival had barely turned its teeth our way. "Guess it's not going anywhere," he muttered, checking the dwindling supplies beside the wood stove before glancing at Caleb. "I don't even know how long." Caleb's dimpled smile was soft but tired. Shadows cast from the firelight, deepening the lean angles of his face. "Long enough to talk," he replied after a moment, folding his hands loosely on his knees. Reed swallowed hard, the walls closing in more than the weather. Had he been hoping to run from things by being lost? Maybe. But now, stranded together, the silence between them felt less like space, and more like a cavern, heavy with all the things neither dared say earlier. "I never expected rescue team would feel like strangers," Reed started hesitantly, voice cracking just beneath the surface. "Not just strangers, like walls I couldn't scale. Everyone was professional, sure. Helpful, but distant, like I was this problem to fix, not a person. I didn't want to be pitied or worse, misunderstood." Caleb's clear blue eyes met his, steady and unshaken, inviting the words Reed wasn't sure he deserved to say aloud. And me? Did I feel like that too? That was different.